War stimulates innovation. It's one of the ironies of warfare in that it drives mankind to innovate extremely fast. And we see the Ukrainians doing that all the time. Look at the way that the drone warfare has transformed the battlefield.
Donald Trump has spoken to the Chinese president. According to Chinese news agencies, we have yet to hear anything from the White House. It comes after reports that Britain's military chiefs fear the prospect of simultaneous wars against Russia and China unless the West rearms quickly. The claim is made by General Sir Patrick Sanders, until recently Chief of the General Staff and now a Times podcast host. All the greats come here. He says many of his fellows, like Major General Tim Cross, who spoke to us earlier this hour, are worried about a major conflict within the next 2 years. Sir Richard Dearlove is the former head of MI6 and he joins us now. Sir Richard, very good afternoon from us. Can we start with that assessment by Sir Patrick Sanders? What do you think we are currently facing?
I think we're facing an undeclared war from Russia already. And I think we will continue to find ourselves in confrontation with Russia, and that will be expressed by the Russians through acts of sabotage, through interference in our internal affairs, through trying to undermine our social fabric. But direct military conflict with Russia, at the moment, I really don't think that's a likely event.
So when we talk about the need to ramp up our military defences and the amount of money that needs to be spent on doing that, are you reassured that the right money is heading to the right places?
Not yet. I'm reassured that there's a proposed increase in the defence budget, but the government have equivocated and haven't even set a deadline for spending 3%. Listening to what Tim Cross said to you earlier, I'm in agreement with him that we should be thinking much more in terms of a rapid rise to 5%, and that it's essential that we get on with a program of significant rearmament, learning the lessons of the conflict in Ukraine and thinking very carefully about what capabilities we need to build and how the money should be spent. But we are in an unusual situation because we have a defence review written in the light of a major war in Europe, which none of us probably historically had expected and hadn't expected really to be contained. So we're at a very important moment geopolitically and strategically, and we have to use our insights and our understanding of what's happened to, if we want peace, prepare for war. I mean, it's as basic as that. It's an old hackneyed saying, but it couldn't be more true at the moment.
We have to be seen to be better armed, don't we? That was a point that my colleague Jane made to Major General Tim Cross. That is an important part of this. But I think we're really interested in your expertise as well on this more hidden stuff. As you mentioned, the acts of sabotage, the interference in our daily lives, that kind of stuff. How do we know that we are sending a message to our enemies that we are better protected for those kind of attacks?
Well, we have the experience and the capability within our intelligence and security community to confront that sort of threat, the threat to critical national infrastructure, and, as it were, the threat through cyber activity, the undersea threat to cables, which has been much discussed. But we need, as it were, to make it clear to the Russians, and it is a Russian threat in Europe at the moment, that we have the sophistication to understand and to know what they're doing. My former service, MI6, should be, put it most bluntly, penetrating the Russian organizations which are conducting this sort of activity. That's primarily the Russian Military Intelligence Service, the GRU, which has a significant capability which is designed to fight undeclared conflict and also to fight, as it were, behind enemy lines. I think some listeners may think that people like me are exaggerating a threat, but I can guarantee that this is an absolutely clear-cut reality now. And of course, the closer you get to Russia, if you go to Poland, if you go to the Baltic republics, if you go to the Czech Republic, those countries which sit close to Russia are very, very aware and very alert to this problem. And aligning ourselves, working closely with them, unifying the response of these countries to the Russian threat is the best way of coping with this problem.
As a man who used to lead the Secret Intelligence Service, can I ask what you made of the Spider's Web operation, the Ukrainian drone attack? It was ambitious, it was audacious, it really did seem to make its mark. Is that the future of warfare?
I don't think it's necessarily the future of warfare. Look, this is exactly what SOE did in France behind enemy lines during World War II. You develop a clandestine capability which fights in an unconventional and disruptive fashion. And I think what happened in the latter stages of the Cold War, that we neglected this capability because we felt that it was no longer relevant and we didn't need it. We've seen very clearly from the example of Ukraine that this type of highly inventive and unconventional thinking has a place in military conflict. And this operation, just like the Israeli operation against Hezbollah, is an extraordinary example of what you can achieve with relatively limited means if you, as it were, attack the enemy in vulnerable places where it's not expecting to be attacked. And it's an extraordinary achievement by the Ukrainians to decimate the Russian bomber fleet in its bases, thousands of kilometers away from its own borders, and to really show that they have that inventiveness and that reach and that flexibility and that imagination, which is part of a successful war campaign. Look, war stimulates innovation. It's one of the ironies of warfare in that it drives mankind to innovate extremely fast. And we see the Ukrainians doing that all the time. Look at the way that the drone warfare has transformed the battlefield.
Yep. Can we stick with borders for a moment? There's some reporting just up on the Times about fears that criminals will exploit budget cuts to target our own border security. How big a threat is there, do you think?
Well, I think the threat from organised crime is sophisticated, and organised criminals, I'm not talking about individual criminals, criminal organisations use all the means at their disposal. And of course, AI, aspects of IT, social media are the vehicles which they use to exploit our open societies, the vulnerability of our open societies. So we need to be very sophisticated in our level of protection. I mean, we are fortunate in the UK on the technical IT side that we have this organization, GCHQ, which is strong, sophisticated, has capability, but that is something which needs to be in continuous deployment, continuous development.
We spoke to you a while back about the threat posed by Chinese-made cars potentially carrying spyware. Since then, they have been banned from Ministry of Defence facilities. You must feel quite vindicated. I remember during the interview at the time, you felt a frustration that perhaps your fears weren't the same fears as the people right at the top making the decisions.
I think I'm pleased to say that those attitudes are changing. I wouldn't say they've completely changed, but Chinese electric vehicles are Chinese computers on wheels which can be programmed by the manufacturer, and the manufacturer is the Chinese Communist Party, or at least is under control of the leadership of the Chinese Communist Party. So we need to be aware of the threat and the problem that these they're using this sort of capability to create dependencies. The Chinese see, the data border, the cyber border, as for them at the moment the easiest area of conflict. They can conduct themselves in a manner which doesn't look like confrontation or doesn't look like direct enmity towards us, but they can exploit these means to, as it were, prepare the ground for themselves.
Yeah. What else would you like to warn us about? Because we're absolutely listening now.
Well, I think we don't want to over-egg the pudding, and I don't like frightening people, but maybe over-egg the pudding is completely the wrong simile in this context, but you understand what I mean.
Not in a Chinese air fryer, that's
people will
sure.
remember that if I say it. But look,
yeah.
We need to worry about Russia. We need to worry about the outcome of the war in Ukraine. We need to worry about China's long-term objectives, which are clearly stated in the documentation for the 20th Party Congress. And we need to worry about organized criminality. That is, sophisticated criminal organizations that might be trafficking immigrants or trafficking drugs, trafficking anything which makes a lot of money. And there are significant threats in these three areas. The fourth area, perhaps, we still need to worry about is radical terrorism, particularly the terrorism of radical Islam, which probably will find something of a new life because of what's happening in Gaza at the moment.